One of the best ways to understand what American exceptionalism looks like is to look at it from the vantage point of other people who've tried to understand it when they weren't first here. And the best illustration of that is Alexis de Tocqueville, the Frenchman in the 1830s and 40s, who decided to come to America and translate it back to Europe. If you own Democracy in America, if you don't own it or haven't read it, do. It's a great book. But it's 1,500 pages and it seems a bit daunting. Buy one off half.com or eBay or your used bookstore of choice and destroy the binding, rip it off, and leave it in 5 to 7 page chunks spread all over your house, in your coffee table and in your rec room and in your gym, because it wasn't meant to be read as a 1,500 page book. It's a compilation of a bunch of travel reports. The way to understand Alexis de Tocqueville is that there are a bunch of rich French guys in the 1830s who say, who are these weirdo religious zealots on the frontier of the earth who are now an economic powerhouse? So when you look at America, we have locked in our head the year 1776 because of the Declaration of Independence and because its role in the Revolutionary War. But to most Europeans, we didn't win the war over England in the 1770s, early 1780s. They had a drunk, crazy King George, and he was distracted fighting France, and no English people really wanted to subdue the New World, and so they hired a bunch of German Hessian mercenaries, and they didn't fight very hard because they were just doing it for money, prostituting themselves as an army. And so the Europeans don't think America really won the revolution until the War of 1812. Think about that as when the Brits came back with extended time play in a soccer game to finally win. And in 1812, we finally secure our freedom. And 20 years later, this nation that was founded because people differed about heaven and hell and the nature of God, and they wanted to argue about these things free from violence, religious liberty and cultural pluralism founded America, not precisely economics. And yet by the 1830s, the transportation revolution, the canal revolution, the proto-railroad revolution, all of these economic dynamic events are happening in America, and Europeans are looking across the sea and they say, we don't get it. These religious weirdos are really economically innovative. We got to figure out why they're so dynamic. And so Tocqueville sort of takes it upon himself to be a travel writer, coming to America and translating America back to Europeans. And so he sends back all these dispatches. And he said, my first idea was, since Americans seem to be more innovative than Europeans, they must have better bureaucrats. They must have better central planners. And so I decided to go to the center of America. And so I went to Washington, D.C. And he says, what I found is that Washington, D.C. is a swamp inhabited by a bunch of lazy, unimaginative people. Not all that much has changed. And so he gets here and he says, this isn't the center of America. This doesn't make any sense. There are 25 colonies or 25 states at the time. He then traveled to 17 of the 25. And he finally writes back to Europe and he says, I have found the meaning of America. I have found the center of America. It's not Washington, D.C. It's the Rotary Club. These people actually believe in persuasion. We Europeans had this continuum between isolated individualism, the Unabomber, some random wacko off in the wilds of Montana, or we have a consolidated state. The modern bad way of saying this, as you may remember in the presidential campaign 4 years ago, there was an ad the Democratic National Committee ran that said, government is just another word for those things we choose to do together. No, it isn't. Community is the word for things we choose to do together. Government is another word for compulsion. Government is not bad. We need government to exist, but government is the entity that has monopoly power on telling you what you can and can't do and taking away your freedom or taking away your taxes. Government needs to do a whole bunch of things. I'm not an anarchist. But the things that government does are by compulsion. They're not community. Community is what you do. Community is when you persuade someone to buy your car. Community is when you build the local school system. Community is when you ultimately persuade somebody to join your social venture philanthropy project or to be engaged in the Rotary. And so he said, Americans don't have this continuum between isolated individualism and state-run collectivism. They have this big middle space called community, but that's done by persuasion, that's done by the heart, that's done by love.